The dust was thick enough to taste. Hermione coughed quietly into the crook of her elbow. She wiped her ink-stained fingers on her heavy woolen skirt. The restricted section of the Ministry archives was completely dark. She held her wand up. The light was dim, barely enough to read the faded labels on the towering iron drawers. 10 years of hiding. 10 years of living as MEA. A quiet clerk who filed papers and kept her head down. She hated it. Every single day was a performance. She smiled at the guards in the lobby. She stamped the requisition forms with perfect precision. She pretended the regime hadn't destroyed everything she loved. She pretended she didn't remember the fire. She pulled open another heavy drawer. The metal shrieked. Hermione flinched. She dropped her hand to her side. She waited for a shout from the corridor. She waited for the heavy thud of boots. Silence. Just the low hum of the ministry wards. She let out a long breath. She went back to work. File 409. The Battle of Hogwarts. She had been looking for this specific drawer for 3 months. She scanned the dates on the brittle parchment. She read the casualty lists. None of it made sense. The rumors were always there, whispered in the break rooms and the underground safe houses by people who still dared to hope. Draco Malfoy, the High Enforcer. The regime's right hand. The man who hunted down traitors for sport. He had been there at the end. He had let Harry Potter die. But the timeline was wrong. Hermione pulled a folder from the very back of the drawer. It was thin. Barely 10 pages. She opened it carefully, afraid the paper would crumble. She stopped moving. The dates lined up perfectly. Malfoy hadn't just been there. He had broken protocol. The field report noted a gap in his movements. 5 minutes where the High Enforcer was completely unaccounted for. 5 minutes where a prisoner transport was suddenly redirected away from the main courtyard. He had pulled someone else out of the fire. Who? Why would the regime's most ruthless killer risk everything to save one person? You're in the wrong section, MEA. The voice was cold. It came from the darkness right behind her. Hermione froze. She dropped the folder. It hit the floor with a loud slap. The sound echoed in the empty archive like a gunshot. She turned around. Draco Malfoy stood in the narrow aisle. He wore a sharp black suit. The silver pin of the Enforcer gleamed on his lapel, catching the faint light from her wand. His silver eyes looked exhausted, shadowed by deep, dark circles. He didn't have his wand out. His hands were tucked casually into his pockets. I was just looking for a misplaced requisition form, Hermione said. Her voice came out too fast. She hated how breathless she sounded. She bit her bottom lip hard, trying to stop the nervous rambling. If he saw through her cover, she was dead. If he looked too closely at her face, the glamour charms wouldn't hold up to a trained enforcer. Malfoy stepped closer. He was entirely too tall. The shadows seemed to bend around him, clinging to the expensive cut of his jacket. He looked down at the folder on the floor. He didn't bend to pick it up. He just looked at it, then slowly back at her. A requisition form, he said. His voice was a slow, aristocratic drawl. It hadn't changed in 10 years. It still sounded like money and sheer arrogance. Yes, Hermione said. She lifted her chin. She refused to cower. She was Gryffindor. She wouldn't shake in front of a Malfoy. For ink. Malfoy looked at her. He didn't smile. He reached up and touched the inner wrist of his left arm, right over the dark fabric of his sleeve. His fingers tapped a rapid, anxious rhythm against his forearm. "You lie terribly," he said. "You don't scare me, Malfoy," Hermione snapped. "You're just a bully in a better suit." He stopped touching his arm immediately. He took another step forward. He was so close she could smell rain and black tea on his clothes. He smelled like cold air and expensive soap, entirely out of place in the dusty archive. "I am not trying to scare you," he said. His voice was a low whisper. It didn't make sense. The enforcer of the regime didn't whisper. He didn't stand this close without delivering a threat. "Pick it up," he said. Hermione didn't move. She held her ground. Her boots were planted firmly on the stone floor. "Pick the file up, Granger." The name hit her like a physical blow. He knew. He knew who she was. He had always known. Hermione grabbed her wand from her pocket. She aimed it straight at his chest. Her hand was perfectly steady. 10 years of surviving had taught her not to hesitate. "Don't call me that." Malfoy didn't even flinch. He looked at the glowing tip of her wand. He looked back up at her eyes. His expression didn't change. He looked completely bored. "If I wanted you dead, you would be dead 10 years ago," he said smoothly. "Pick up the file. We are leaving. I'm not going anywhere with you. You are." He stepped right into the point of her wand. The wood pressed sharply against his expensive suit. "Because if the guards catch you in here, they will not ask questions." "I will." Hermione glared at him. She searched his pale face for a trap. She looked for the cruelty she remembered from school. She only found exhaustion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why don't you just call the guards? I'm the biggest prize in the ministry." Malfoy sighed. He looked incredibly tired. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent in the dim wand light. "Because I need a personal researcher. I am a clerk." "You are an archivist who breaks into restricted files," he corrected. "You start today. My office. Now." He turned his back on her. It was an insane thing to do. He just turned his back on an armed enemy. The most wanted woman in Britain had her wand aimed directly at his spine. Hermione could hex him right now. She could stun him, bind him, and run for the exit. But where would she go? The building was heavily guarded. The wards would lock down the second she fired a spell. She bit her lip again. She tasted a drop of blood. She lowered her wand. She shoved it back into her pocket with shaking fingers. She bent down and picked up the file. "Fine," she said. Malfoy started walking. She followed him. The ministry halls were freezing. They walked in complete silence. Malfoy kept his long strides even. People moved out of his way instantly. Junior Aurors pressed themselves against the damp stone walls when they saw him coming. Ministry workers averted their eyes, staring fiercely at their shoes. No one looked at him. No one dared to look at her walking behind him. He was terrifying to them. He was a ghost story they told to keep the lower ranks in line. Hermione kept her eyes strictly on the floor. Her mind raced with 100 different plans of escape. None of them ended well. He knew her name. He knew she was Hermione Granger. Why hadn't he turned her in? The bounty on her head was massive enough to buy a small country. The regime wanted the last remnants of the Order completely destroyed. Malfoy was their best weapon. He hunted traitors. He was supposed to kill her on sight. But he hadn't drawn his wand. He hadn't called the guards. He had just offered her a job. They reached the elevator. The golden grills slid open with a sharp clatter. They stepped inside. The space was too small. The air felt heavy. Malfoy stood in the corner. He watched the floor numbers change on the brass dial. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. "If this is a trick," Hermione said to the closed doors, "it's a very elaborate one. Everything is elaborate with you, Granger." He replied. His tone was flat. "You're going to interrogate me. I have better things to do. Then why take me to your office? Why not the holding cells?" "Because," he said, turning his head slightly to look at her, "you are terrible at hiding. You leave ink smudges on the restricted cabinet handles. You walk too loudly. You are going to get yourself killed. I would prefer that didn't happen on my floor. I don't leave ink smudges." Malfoy reached out. He caught her hand. Hermione gasped. She tried to yank her hand away. His grip was firm but oddly gentle. It didn't hurt. He turned her hand over. He dragged his thumb across the side of her index finger. A dark blue smear stained his pale skin. He let her go immediately. He wiped his thumb on a conjured handkerchief. "You were saying," he said softly. Hermione rubbed her hand against her skirt. Her skin felt hot where he had touched it. It burned like a brand. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. They reached the top floor. The Enforcer's level. The carpet was thick and dark red, swallowing the sound of their footsteps. The lights were dim. It felt exactly like a tomb. A man leaned against the wall outside Malfoy's office. Theodore Knott. He wore a slightly messy suit. His tie was loose around his collar. He looked incredibly bored. He spun a silver galleon across his knuckles with practiced ease. He caught it when he saw them approach. "Well," Theo said. He pushed off the wall and stood up straight. "You actually brought a stray home." Malfoy didn't stop walking. "Out of the way, Not." Theo looked at Hermione. He grinned. It was a sharp, highly cynical smile. "Hello, MIA," Theo said. "Or whatever we're calling you today." Hermione gripped her file tighter. She recognized him from school. He was Malfoy's second-in-command now. The only person in the entire ministry who spoke to the High Enforcer without trembling. "Hello, Theodore," she said clearly, keeping her chin up. Theo laughed. It was a genuine, bright sound in the dreary hallway. "She bites. I like this one, Draco. Much better than the last assistant." "The last assistant asked too many questions," Malfoy said. He unlocked his heavy oak office door with a lazy wave of his hand. "This one asks more," Theo said. He leaned closer to Malfoy. His smile faded slightly. "Are you sure about this? Malfoy stopped. He looked at Theo. The exhaustion in his eyes seemed much heavier for a second. Yes. Theo held his hands up in surrender. Your funeral, mate. Try not to break her. Theo walked away, whistling a tune that sounded terribly out of place in the dark corridor. Malfoy stepped into his office. He waited. Hermione stood in the doorway. She looked at the dark wood. She looked at the shadows. The office was huge. Books covered the walls from the floor all the way to the high ceiling. A massive mahogany desk sat in the exact middle of the room. The rain beat aggressively against the large window behind the desk. Get in, Malfoy said. Hermione stepped inside. Malfoy waved his hand again. The heavy door slammed shut. The locks clicked into place. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hermione spun around. The sound of the heavy metal locks was incredibly loud in the quiet room. It sounded final. She was trapped. Malfoy walked around to his desk. He didn't look at her. He took off his suit jacket. He draped it carefully over a leather chair. He rolled up his crisp white sleeves. The dark mark was stark black against his pale skin. Hermione couldn't look away from it. It looked fresh. It looked like a permanent bruise. Sit, he said. I prefer to stand. Suit yourself. Malfoy walked over to a small table in the corner. A silver tea set rested on it. Steam curled into the cold air of the office. He poured hot water into a delicate porcelain cup, adding exactly 1 sugar cube with silver tongs and a small splash of milk. He stirred it twice. Hermione watched him. Her hands shook slightly. She forced them to be still. She clasped them behind her back and dug her fingernails into her palms. He walked back to her. He held the cup out. Hermione didn't take it. Is it poisoned? She asked. Malfoy looked at her. His silver eyes were completely unreadable. He reached up and touched his left wrist again, right over the mark. His fingers tapped the same anxious rhythm. If I wanted to hurt you, Granger, I would not waste good tea. He pushed the cup closer. Hermione took it cautiously. The ceramic was incredibly warm against her cold fingers. It felt nice. It felt like a small comfort in a terrible place. She took a small sip. It was Earl Grey. 1 sugar. A splash of milk. Exactly the way she drank it. She looked up at him. Her mind went completely blank for a second. How did he know that? She hadn't spoken to him in 10 years. They had never shared tea at school. Malfoy was already walking back to his desk. He sat down heavily in his chair. He pulled a tall stack of parchment toward him. He picked up a black quill. Your desk is in the corner, he said, not looking up from the paper. Do not touch my things. Do not leave this room without my permission. Do not ask me about the war. Hermione held the teacup. The steam rose between them, smelling like bergamot and strange comfort. Why didn't you turn me in? She asked. You had the chance, and you didn't. Why? Malfoy's quill stopped moving. The rain hit the glass outside. The silence in the room was heavy and pressing. Do not test my patience today, Granger, he said quietly. I have very little left, and none of it is for you. He went back to writing. The scratching of his quill filled the room. Hermione stood there. The tea was perfect. The door was securely locked. The most terrifying man in the regime was doing paperwork while she drank his tea. She took another sip. She was going to find out what he was hiding. Even if it took all 10 years of her patience. She was going to break the Enforcer. Part 2. The Collision 3 Days. Hermione had been trapped in Draco Malfoy's office for exactly 3 days. She was going completely out of her mind. She picked up a stack of requisition forms. She tapped them aggressively against the polished mahogany desk, aligning the edges until they were perfectly flush. She slammed them down on the completed pile. The loud smack made the silver inkwells rattle. Malfoy didn't even look up. He was reading a lengthy report from the Department of Magical Lore Enforcement. He had been reading it for 2 solid hours. He hadn't spoken to her since he ordered her to organize his filing cabinet that morning. Hermione picked up another stack. She tapped it against the desk. Harder this time. Smack. Nothing. He just turned a page. The scratching of his expensive black quill was the only sound in the cavernous room, steady and entirely maddening. If you hit the desk one more time, Malfoy said quietly, still not looking at her, I am going to throw those files out the window. They're important ministry documents. Hermione shot back immediately. I am the High Enforcer. I decide what is important. And keeping me locked in here to organize your stationery is important? Malfoy finally looked up. His silver eyes were flat and completely unbothered. You are terrible at filing, Granger. Half of those are upside down. Hermione bristled. She grabbed the stack and flipped it over. They were perfectly right side up. She glared at him across the vast expanse of his desk. You're doing this on purpose. She said. Doing what? Ignoring me. I ignore most people. You are not special. Hermione stood up. She marched over to his desk. She leaned across the dark, polished wood, invading his space entirely. You're a coward, Malfoy. He put his quill down. He did it very slowly. He looked at her hands, planted firmly on his desk, and then up at her face. He didn't look angry. He just looked terribly tired. A coward, he repeated slowly. Yes. You brought me here. You didn't turn me in. And now you won't even look at me. You won't answer my questions. You're hiding. I am working, he said. You're hiding from the rest of the ministry, Hermione pushed, her voice rising. You have the most wanted woman in the country locked in your office, and you're making me file ink requests. What are you playing at? Do you think I'm going to just sit here quietly until you decide what to do with me? Because I won't. Malfoy stood up. He was much taller than she remembered from school. The sheer size of him in the dark suit was intimidating. He stepped around the desk. He stopped when he was barely a foot away from her. Hermione held her ground. She refused to back away. She bit her bottom lip, ignoring the sharp sting of teeth on skin. I'm playing at keeping you alive, he said. His voice was a harsh whisper. A game you seem determined to lose. I don't need your protection. You were using your real signature on library checkouts, Granger. In a restricted section monitored by the Inquisition. You absolutely need my protection. Hermione opened her mouth. She closed it. She had done that once. She had been so exhausted, so completely drained from translating ancient runes all night, that she simply forgot her alias. It was a stupid, careless mistake. How did you know about that? She asked quietly. Malfoy reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small slip of parchment. He dropped it on the desk between them. It was the checkout slip. Her messy handwriting was unmistakable. Because I am the one who intercepts the security reports before they reach the Dark Lord's desk. He said. I burned the original. This is a copy. Hermione looked down at the slip of paper. He had covered for her. The enforcer of the regime had covered for a known traitor. He had committed an act of treason just to hide her bad handwriting. Why? She asked again. Why are you doing this? Malfoy looked away. He reached up and touched the inner wrist of his left arm. The habit was entirely unconscious. Because I prefer my office quiet, he said. And public executions are noisy. It was a terrible lie. Before Hermione could point that out, the heavy oak door opened. Theo Knott slipped inside. He shut the door quickly behind him. He didn't bother knocking. We have a problem, Theo said. Malfoy stepped back from Hermione instantly. The distance between them felt cold. What is it? Malfoy asked. His voice was completely flat again. Travers, Theo said, tossing a galleon in the air and catching it. He's doing a sweep. Someone tripped the lower archive wards yesterday, and is looking for a rat. Hermione went completely still. The lower archives. That was her. She had been careless there too. Is he coming up here? Malfoy asked. He's already on the floor, Theo replied. He looked at Hermione. He tilted his head. And he's checking every office. Even yours. Malfoy swore softly. Delay him, Malfoy ordered. I can give you 30 seconds, Theo said. After that, it looks suspicious. Try to hide the stray, Draco. Theo slipped back out the door. Malfoy turned to Hermione. He moved faster than she could track. He grabbed her arm. He pulled her hard against his chest. He dragged her behind the heavy velvet curtains that covered the massive window. The space between the glass and the thick fabric was tiny. Hermione stumbled. She hit his chest hard. Malfoy caught her. He wrapped one arm completely around her waist, pulling her flush against him so her feet wouldn't show under the hem of the curtain. He clamped his other hand securely over her mouth. His grip was incredibly strong. The locks on the door clicked open. Malfoy had unlocked them with a burst of wandless magic. The door banged open violently. You took your time, Travers snarled. Hermione couldn't see anything. The velvet was thick and smelled like dust and old magic. But she could feel everything. Malfoy was pressed completely against her. His chest was hard. His thigh was slotted securely between hers, holding her weight so she wouldn't slip on the polished floor. His hand was clamped tightly over her mouth. His palm was warm. His long fingers dug into her jaw, keeping her perfectly still. I was resting, Travers. Malfoy's voice drifted seamlessly through the curtain. It sounded completely bored, utterly relaxed. It was a staggering performance. because beneath the heavy curtain, Hermione could feel his heart. It was hammering against his ribs, right where she was pressed against him. It was beating so fast and so hard it felt like a trapped bird. He was terrified. Resting? Travers laughed. It was a nasty, grating sound. We have a security breach. Someone tripped the wards in the lower archives. A rat, most likely. Malfoy drawled smoothly. The lower levels are infested. The Dark Lord wants a full sweep of the entire building. Every floor. Every room. Every closet. Hermione stopped breathing. If Travers pulled the curtain back, it was over. She would be dragged to the dungeons. Malfoy would be executed for high treason before the sun went down. Malfoy's thumb stroked her cheekbone. It was a tiny, entirely involuntary movement. A grounding touch. He was trying to calm her down. Or maybe he was trying to calm himself. You are welcome to sweep my office, Travers. Malfoy said slowly. The ice in his voice was absolute. But if you move a single piece of parchment on my desk, I will remove your hands. Travers scoffed loudly. But Hermione heard his heavy footsteps stop. No one challenged the High Enforcer. Not even the head of the Inquisition. Fine. Travers spat. But the lockdown remains in strict effect until morning. No one leaves the building. The door slammed shut. The locks clicked rapidly back into place. Malfoy didn't let her go. He stood there in the dark behind the curtain. His chest heaved heavily against hers. His hand stayed firmly over her mouth. Hermione looked up. She couldn't see his face in the pitch black. She could only hear his harsh, ragged breathing. She could smell the rain and the sharp scent of black tea. She reached up slowly. She wrapped her fingers around his wrist. She gently pulled his hand away from her mouth. Malfoy let her move his hand, but he didn't step back. He didn't let go of her waist. They were still pressed completely together. He's gone, Hermione whispered. I know. Malfoy whispered back. He rested his forehead heavily against the cold glass of the window behind her. He squeezed his eyes shut tight. You're shaking. Hermione noted quietly. Malfoy pulled away instantly. The sudden loss of his body heat was shocking. He pushed the curtain aside and stepped out into the dim office. Hermione followed him. The office was empty. The rain was still beating aggressively against the glass. Malfoy walked straight over to the small table in the corner. He poured a generous glass of fire whiskey. He didn't bother with a glass for her. He drank it straight down. You need a better alias, Granger, he said. His voice was hoarse and rough. Hermione stood by the curtain. Her heart was still beating wildly in her chest. Not from fear of Travers. From the feeling of Malfoy's thumb stroking her cheek in the dark. You're protecting me, she said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a solid fact. Malfoy poured another glass. I am protecting my own interests. What interests? She challenged, stepping toward him. I have nothing. The Order is entirely gone. Harry is gone. What could you possibly want from me? Malfoy slammed the heavy glass down on the table. The crystal rang sharply. He turned abruptly to look at her. The exhaustion was gone. The cold Enforcer was gone. For a split second, he just looked utterly desperate. "I want you to stop trying to get yourself killed," he said. "That's not an answer. It is the only answer you are going to get." He walked briskly back to his desk. He picked up his quill. His hand was perfectly steady again. The iron mask was securely back in place. "Go back to your desk, Granger. We are locked in here until morning. I suggest you find a comfortable way to sleep in that chair. I am not answering any more questions." Hermione walked slowly over to her small desk in the corner. She sat down. She looked at him across the room. He was already writing. He looked exactly like the cold monster the rest of the world thought he was. But Hermione knew the absolute truth now. Monsters didn't stroke your cheek in the dark to keep you calm. Monsters didn't have hearts that hammered with terror when you were in danger. She bit her lip again. He was hiding something massive. And she was going to stay right here until she found out exactly what it was. The rain outside grew louder. It battered the thick glass like a warning. Hermione pulled a blank sheet of parchment toward her. She picked up a quill. She didn't have anything to write, but she needed something to do with her hands. Her fingers still tingled where she had touched his wrist. She thought about the restricted archive. She thought about the 5 missing minutes in the field report. Malfoy had let Harry die. That was the accepted history. But someone had survived that day because Draco Malfoy had broken protocol and pulled them out of the fire. Who was it? Why did he care so much about keeping a lowly archivist alive 10 years later? She watched him from across the room. The silver Enforcer pin gleamed in the dim light. He turned another page of his report. He was ignoring her again. But it didn't matter. The game had changed. He wasn't her captor anymore. He was her protector. And he was terrified of anyone finding out. Part 3. The push-pull. The carriage smelled strongly of wet leather and ozone. Hermione sat entirely stiff against the velvet cushions. The rain was coming down in sheets outside, blurring the dark streets of London. The anti-apparition wards on the ministry carriage hummed a low, aggressive note against her teeth. Draco Malfoy sat opposite her. He was perfectly still. He watched the rain track down the charmed glass. His silver Enforcer pin caught the occasional flash of street lamps passing by. He hadn't spoken since he grabbed her arm in his office, shoved a heavy black cloak at her, and ordered her downstairs. "Where exactly are we going?" Hermione asked. It was the 3rd time she had asked. Malfoy didn't look away from the window. A suspected safe house in Nocturne Alley. Hermione gripped the edge of her seat. "A safe house for who?" "Order remnants," he said smoothly. "An illegal historians digging into things they shouldn't." Her stomach dropped. Was he handing her over? Had the momentary lapse in his office been a fluke? "You're taking me to a raid." "I am taking you to do your job, Granger." He corrected, his voice clipped. "You are an archivist. There is an archive. I want you to read it before Travers burns the building to the ground." The carriage lurched as it hit a cobblestone. Hermione fell forward slightly. Malfoy's hand shot out. He caught her elbow in a vice grip. He steadied her instantly. His fingers were burning hot through her thin sleeve. "Careful," he murmured. He let go of her the second she was upright. He went right back to looking at the rain. Hermione rubbed her arm. The heat from his touch lingered on her skin. It was maddening. He was the most dangerous man in the city, but he treated her like something fragile. The carriage rolled to a sudden, violent halt. Malfoy stood up. The exhaustion vanished from his face. The cold, untouchable mask of the High Enforcer snapped into place. "Do not leave my side," he ordered. "Do not speak to anyone. If you draw your wand, I will break it." Hermione lifted her chin. "I don't need a babysitter. You need a keeper," he said flatly. He kicked the carriage door open. The rain poured in. He stepped out first. He didn't offer his hand. He just waited for her to climb down into the muddy street. Nocturne Alley was pitch black. 4 junior aurors stood in the pouring rain, flanking the heavy wooden door of an abandoned apothecary. They snapped to rigid attention the second Malfoy's boots hit the cobblestones. "Sir," one of them barked. Malfoy didn't even look at them. "Is it secure?" "Yes, sir. We cleared the first floor. The suspect is in the basement." Malfoy walked past them. The aurors shrank back against the brick walls to give him a wide berth. Hermione followed closely in his wake. The men didn't even glance at her. Malfoy's presence took up all the oxygen in the street. He kicked the door open. It splintered loudly off its iron hinges. Hermione flinched. Malfoy walked into the dark building. He drew his wand. A bright, harsh white light illuminated the dusty apothecary. Smashed glass littered the floor. He moved with terrifying grace. Hermione watched him sweep the room. He wasn't the tired man from the office. He was a weapon. He checked every corner, his wand steady, his eyes sweeping the shadows. He looked entirely capable of killing everyone in the room without breaking a sweat. It made her stomach twist. She hated him like this. She hated that he was good at it. "Clear," Malfoy said. Theo Knott stepped out of the shadows near the basement stairs. Theo said cheerfully. "You brought the stray out for a walk." Malfoy ignored him. "Status." "Old man in the basement," Theo reported, spinning his wand between his fingers. "He won't talk to the junior aurors." Spat on one of them. It was very funny. "Travers is on his way, so I suggest we move fast if you want to keep this clean." Malfoy's jaw tightened. "Take the perimeter. Not. Make sure Travers takes a wrong turn." Theo saluted lazily. He looked at Hermione and winked. "Try not to bleed on his suit, MIA. He gets terribly cranky about dry cleaning." Theo vanished out the front door. Malfoy walked to the basement stairs. He looked back at Hermione. "Stay behind me," he said. They walked down the rickety wooden stairs. The basement smelled of rot and old parchment. An old man was tied to a chair in the center of the room. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Malfoy stepped into the light. The old man spat on the floor. "Death Eater scum." Malfoy didn't react. He walked over to a heavy wooden desk in the corner. He started pulling open the drawers. "Granger," Malfoy said quietly. "Get to work." Hermione stepped forward. She looked at the old man. She recognized him. It was old Abernathy, a friend of the Weasleys. He used to fix their clocks. Abernathy gaped when he saw her. He opened his mouth. Hermione's heart stopped. If he said her name, the junior aurors upstairs would hear. Malfoy moved instantly. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He grabbed Abernathy by the collar of his shirt. He yanked the old man upward, silencing him with a brutal shove against the stone wall. "Say a single word," Malfoy snarled, his voice a lethal hiss, "and I will cut out your tongue." Abernathy choked, terrified. Hermione gasped. "Malfoy, stop!" Malfoy dropped the man back into the chair. He didn't look at Hermione. He pointed his wand at the desk. The remaining locked drawers blew open with a violent crack. "Read the files, Granger," he commanded harshly. Hermione ran to the desk. Her hands were shaking violently. She pulled the stacks of parchment out. She hated him. She hated how easily he resorted to violence. She hated the terror in Abernathy's eyes. She scanned the documents quickly. They were rebel supply routes. Safe house locations. If Travers found these, dozens of people would die. "They're encrypted," Hermione lied smoothly. "It's just old poetry." Malfoy looked at the papers. He looked at her. He knew she was lying. "Poetry," he repeated flatly. "Yes." Malfoy raised his wand. He pointed it directly at the massive stack of papers in her hands. Incendio. The files burst into bright, roaring flames. Hermione cried out. She dropped the burning parchment. She jumped back, but not fast enough. A sharp piece of splintered wood from the exploded desk caught her arm as she stumbled, slicing a neat, shallow line across her forearm. She hissed in pain, grabbing her arm. The files turned to ash on the stone floor in seconds. Malfoy whirled around. The cold, ruthless Enforcer mask shattered the instant he saw the blood on her fingers. "You're hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. It was panic. He crossed the room. He didn't care about the aurors upstairs. He didn't care about Abernathy. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her arm toward the light of his wand. "It's just a scrape," Hermione said, trying to pull away. He didn't let go. His grip was tight, desperate. "Don't move," he commanded softly. Pulling a clean white handkerchief from his inner pocket, he carefully wrapped it around her forearm. His long fingers moved with astonishing gentleness, a complete contrast to the violence he had just committed seconds before, tying the fabric tight enough to stop the bleeding without hurting her. He was standing entirely too close. Hermione looked up at his face. His jaw was locked tight. His silver eyes were fixed on the tiny cut on her arm like it was a mortal wound. He looked genuinely terrified. "Malfoy," she whispered. He looked up. Their faces were inches apart. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She could hear his breathing, heavy and uneven. "I told you to be careful," he said hoarsely. He didn't step back. He held her wrist, his thumb resting right over her pulse. Her heart was racing. She knew he could feel it. "Why did you burn the files?" she asked softly. "Because Travers is 3 minutes away," he whispered back. "And if he found them, he would have killed this old man. And you." Hermione gaped at him. He hadn't burned the files to destroy evidence. He had burned them to protect the Order. He had burned them to protect her. Before she could say anything, heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs. Malfoy let go of her wrist instantly. He took a huge step back. The ice returned to his eyes in a flash. Travers stormed down the stairs, followed closely by Theo Knott. "What is going on down here?" Travers barked, looking at the pile of ashes. "What did you burn?" "Contraband," Malfoy said smoothly. He didn't even look at Travers. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit. The suspect was hoarding illegal dark texts. "I disposed of them. I needed those for questioning." Travers shouted, "Take it up with the Dark Lord." Malfoy replied, entirely bored, "I do not answer to the Inquisition." Travers flushed an ugly, angry red. He glared at Malfoy, then his eyes snapped to Hermione. He looked at the white handkerchief wrapped around her arm. "And who is this?" Travers demanded. Malfoy stepped smoothly between Travers and Hermione. He blocked Travers' view completely. "My personal researcher." Malfoy said. The threat in his voice was low and unmistakable. "Do not speak to her." Travers sneered, but he backed down. He signaled to the junior Aurors. "Take the old man to holding." They dragged Abernathy up the stairs. Theo stayed behind. He walked over to the pile of ashes. He poked it with his shoe. "Shame about the dark texts," Theo said cheerfully. He looked at Hermione's bandaged arm. He looked at Malfoy. "You really do break all your toys, don't you, Draco?" Malfoy completely ignored him. "We are leaving." He didn't wait for Hermione. He turned and walked up the stairs. Hermione followed him. Her arm throbbed slightly, but the white handkerchief was tied perfectly. Theo fell into step beside her as they reached the dark street. The rain was still pouring down. Malfoy was already walking toward the carriage. "He's a nightmare, isn't he?" Theo said quietly, spinning the galleon over his knuckles. "He's a bully," Hermione said. Theo laughed softly. "Sure he is. But he's a very particular kind of bully, M.A." Hermione looked at Theo. The cynical smile was gone. He looked completely serious. "What do you mean?" she asked. Theo looked at Malfoy's retreating back. "I mean, I've known Draco for 20 years. I watched him order a raid on a rebel camp without blinking. I watched him burn a man alive for treason." Hermione felt sick. "But," Theo continued, lowering his voice so only she could hear over the rain, "I also know that 10 years ago, he walked into the Battle of Hogwarts with a very specific mission. And it wasn't to fight for the Dark Lord." Hermione stopped walking. The rain soaked through her cloak. "The rumor," she whispered. "The rumor is entirely true," Theo said simply. "He let Potter die." "Who did he save?" Hermione demanded. Her voice shook. "Who was it, Theo?" Theo looked at her. He looked at the white handkerchief carefully tied around her arm. He smiled a very sad, knowing smile. "You're a historian, M.A. Figure it out." Theo walked away, disappearing into the dark alley. Hermione stood in the pouring rain. Her mind was spinning. Malfoy had sacrificed the war. He had let Harry fall. He had let the entire world plunge into darkness, just to pull one person out of the fire. Someone he loved. "Granger." Malfoy's voice cut through the rain. He was standing by the open carriage door. He was holding the heavy door open for her. The rain was soaking his expensive suit, but he didn't seem to care. He was just watching her. Hermione walked toward him. She climbed into the carriage. He followed her inside and slammed the door shut. The quiet hum of the anti-apparition wards returned. The carriage jerked forward. Malfoy sat across from her. He looked exhausted again. He leaned his head back against the velvet cushions and closed his eyes. Hermione watched him. He was a monster. He was the High Enforcer. He had let her best friend die. But he had also just risked his life to cover up her lie. He had panicked over a tiny scratch on her arm. He had tied the bandage with hands that trembled. She looked at her bandaged arm. Who did he save? She looked back at Malfoy. His silver eyes were closed. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night in 10 years. He had saved someone he loved. And now he was protecting a lowly archivist with his life. Hermione bit her lip. The timeline. The dates. The way he knew exactly how she took her tea. The way he recognized her handwriting instantly. A terrible, impossible thought bloomed in the back of her mind. No. It couldn't be. Malfoy opened his eyes. He caught her watching him. Does it hurt? He asked quietly, nodding at her arm. His voice was so gentle it broke her heart. No, Hermione whispered. Malfoy didn't look away. He kept his eyes on hers. The distance between them in the small carriage felt suddenly, overwhelmingly small. Good, he said softly. He reached across the space between them. He gently brushed a wet curl off her cheek. His knuckles lingered against her skin for a second longer than necessary. Hermione stopped breathing entirely. He pulled his hand back. He looked out the window into the dark rain. The terrible, impossible thought in her mind grew louder. It was her. He had saved her. Part 4. The crack the Ministry archives were freezing at 3 in the morning. Hermione sat on the floor of Malfoy's office, surrounded by stacks of requisition forms and historical records. The only light in the room came from a single, charmed candle floating above her head. Malfoy was asleep on the leather sofa across the room. He hadn't offered her the sofa. He had simply transfigured his desk chair into a surprisingly comfortable cot for her, taken off his suit jacket, and collapsed onto the leather. He was deeply asleep. The defensive wards on his office were pulsing with a thick, heavy hum, keeping the rest of the world entirely locked out. Hermione couldn't sleep. Her arm ached, and her mind was racing. Theo's words echoed relentlessly in the quiet room. He let Potter die. You're a historian, M.A. Figure it out. She pulled another file from the heavy brass cabinet Malfoy had accidentally left unlocked. It was the official death record from the Battle of Hogwarts. She spread the parchment out on the floor. Harry Potter. May 2nd, 1998. Cause of death. Avada Kedavra. Ron Weasley. May 2nd, 1998. Cause of death. Spell damage. She traced the dates with her ink-stained fingers. Then, she pulled out a separate file. The one she had stolen from the lower archives before Malfoy caught her. The Inquisition's prisoner transfer log from 10 years ago. She found her alias. MEA. Found wandering near the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Memory entirely wiped. Wand snapped. Detained. May 2nd, 1998. Hermione looked at the 2 pieces of parchment. May 2nd. She had woken up in a ministry holding cell on May 3rd with no memory of the war, no memory of Harry, and no memory of magic. She thought she was a muggle who had stumbled into a nightmare. It had taken 3 years of living in the slums of Diagon Alley before fragments of her memory started to bleed back in. It took 5 years before she remembered her own name. Hermione Granger. The regime thought Hermione Granger was dead. Everyone thought she had burned in the castle. But she hadn't. Someone had pulled her out of the fire. Someone had wiped her memory to make sure the Inquisition wouldn't execute her as a war criminal. Someone had planted her safely in the lower ranks of the ministry where she would blend in, perfectly invisible. She looked up. Malfoy was still asleep. His chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm. The harsh lines of his face were entirely smoothed out in the dark. Without the cold Enforcer mask, he just looked incredibly young. He looked like the boy she used to argue with in the library. He had saved her. He had let the world fall to pieces. He had let Voldemort win. He had stood by while the Order was slaughtered, just to drag her out of the wreckage and hide her away. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She scrambled to her feet. The parchment crinkled loudly under her boots. Malfoy woke instantly. He didn't stretch or yawn. He was suddenly and completely awake. His hand snapped to his wand on the low table before his eyes were even fully open. He sat up, his silver eyes scanning the shadows. His eyes locked onto her. The tension in his shoulders dropped immediately. "What is it?" he asked. His voice was thick with sleep, rough and entirely unguarded. "May 2nd, Hermione whispered. Malfoy went perfectly still. He sat perfectly still on the edge of the sofa. The wand in his hand lowered slightly, pointing at the floor. The shadows in the office seemed to grow heavier. "Granger," he said slowly. It was a warning. Hermione walked toward him. She clutched the 2 pieces of parchment in her hands. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt her ribs. "May 2nd, 1998, she repeated, stopping right in front of him. "Harry died. The castle fell. And a nameless muggle-born girl was found in the forest with no memory of who she was." Malfoy didn't look at the parchment. He looked at her face. His jaw locked tightly. "Go back to sleep," he said flatly. The cold Enforcer mask was slipping violently back into place. "No." Hermione dropped the files on the small table next to his wand. "You wiped my memory. I did what was necessary. You let Harry die." Her voice cracked on the words. The accusation hung in the freezing air between them, sharp and devastating. Malfoy stood up. He towered over her in the dark. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely wrecked. He reached up and touched the inner wrist of his left arm. The dark mark was hidden beneath his crisp white shirt, but he rubbed the skin over it like it was burning him alive. "Yes," Malfoy said quietly. "I did." Hermione stepped back. Her breath hitched. Hearing him admit it was entirely different from guessing it. "Why?" she demanded, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "Why would you do that? You sacrificed everything. You let them win. You let the world become this nightmare. Because you were dying, Hermione." Her real name. It was the first time he had said it in 10 years. The sound of it in his low, desperate voice shattered something massive in her chest. Malfoy stepped toward her. He closed the distance she had just made. He was standing so close she could feel the heat radiating off him. "You were bleeding out on the floor of the Great Hall," he said. His voice was shaking. The aristocratic drawl was completely gone. Bellatrix was walking toward you. She was going to finish it. Potter was distracted. Weasley was unconscious. No one was looking at you. No one but me. Hermione couldn't speak. She just gaped at him, the tears tracking hot and fast down her cold face. "I had a choice," Malfoy whispered, leaning down slightly so his face was level with hers. His silver eyes were bright and terrifyingly wide. "I could turn my wand on my aunt and fight for the Order. I could have bought Potter the time he needed to win. Why didn't you?" She sobbed quietly. "Because if I fought her, she would have killed you first," he said fiercely. "And I couldn't let you die. So you let the world burn instead." "I would burn it down 1,000 times," he said softly, fiercely. 1,000 times, Hermione. Just to keep you breathing. The absolute devotion in his voice was staggering. It wasn't cold. It wasn't ruthless. It was desperate and raw and entirely beautiful. He hadn't been acting as her captor these last few days. He had been acting as her shield. He had spent the last 10 years playing the monster just so he could stay high enough in the regime to make sure her fake name never ended up on an execution list. Every cruel thing he had done, every terrible rumor, it was all to keep his position. To keep her safe. "You wiped my memory," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If they caught you, they would have used legitimacy," he said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, as if he was physically restraining himself from touching her. "They would have seen who you were. They would have tortured you until your mind broke, and then they would have killed you in front of me. I couldn't let you remember. It was the only way to keep you safe. And then you left me." "I watched you every single day," he corrected harshly. "Every day. For 10 years. I made sure you had a job. I made sure your flat had heat. I made sure the patrols never walked down your street." Hermione looked at him. The exhaustion in his eyes made perfect sense now. He was carrying the burden of the entire broken world on his shoulders, all because he loved a girl who hated him. "You're a fool, Draco," she breathed. "I know." He looked away. The confession hung heavy and thick between them. He had finally said it. The Enforcer had admitted his greatest treason. Hermione reached out. She didn't punch him. She didn't yell. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was hammering violently against his ribs. Just like it had been behind the curtain. Malfoy flinched at her touch. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Don't." He whispered hoarsely. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you don't hate me." "I don't hate you," Hermione said softly. Malfoy opened his eyes. The desperation in them was absolute. He looked at her hand on his chest, and then he looked at her mouth. Hermione didn't wait. She grabbed the lapels of his wrinkled shirt and pulled him down. Malfoy let out a rough, broken sound in the back of his throat. He caught her face in his hands. His fingers tangled in her wild curls, holding her exactly where he wanted her. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and full of a decade of pent-up longing. It was 10 years of watching her from the shadows. It was 10 years of pretending to be a monster. Hermione kissed him back just as fiercely. She opened her mouth to him, wrapping her arms securely around his neck, pulling him as close as physically possible. He tasted like fire whiskey and rain. Malfoy backed her up against the heavy wooden desk. He didn't let go of her face. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones frantically, as if he needed to memorize the shape of her under his hands. He kissed her until she couldn't breathe. He kissed her until the cold room felt entirely too hot. Hermione tangled her fingers in his fine blonde hair. She pulled him closer, her body pressing flush against his dark clothes. Malfoy broke the kiss, gasping for air. He rested his forehead against hers. His chest was heaving. "You are going to get me killed, Granger," he breathed, his eyes closed. "I'm keeping you alive," Hermione whispered back, brushing her thumb across his jawline. He turned his head and pressed a hard, lingering kiss to the center of her palm. The devotion in the gesture made her heart ache. "We can't stay here," he said softly, his voice rough. "Travers is getting suspicious. Theo warned me today. The Dark Lord is starting to ask why the High Enforcer is spending so much time in his office. Then we leave." Malfoy opened his eyes. "If we leave, we become the most wanted fugitives in the country. There will be nowhere to hide. They will hunt us until they find us." "They are already hunting me," Hermione pointed out. "And you just committed high treason by kissing me." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of Malfoy's mouth. It was the first time she had seen him smile in 10 years. It changed his entire face. "I committed high treason 10 years ago," he corrected smoothly. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him again. He buried his face in her neck. He breathed in deeply, his nose pressing into the soft skin just below her ear. "I won't let them take you," he murmured against her skin. "I will burn this entire ministry to the ground before I let them touch you." Hermione wrapped her arms around his back. She held him tightly in the dark office. The war was lost. The world was broken. But she wasn't alone anymore. "We burn it together, Draco," she promised quietly. Malfoy lifted his head. He looked at her, his silver eyes shining with a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. He leaned down and kissed her again, slower this time. Softer. A promise sealed in the dark. For the first time in 10 years, Hermione Granger wasn't afraid of the Enforcer. She was entirely, completely safe. She stayed wrapped in his arms for a long time. The only sound in the office was the steady hum of the defensive wards and the heavy rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. For 10 years, she had believed she was utterly alone in a broken world. She had thought the boy she despised in school had grown up to become a nightmare. Instead, he had become her only shield. Malfoy kissed the top of her head. It was a soft, grounding gesture. "We need a plan," Hermione murmured, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I have a plan." Malfoy replied quietly. His hand smoothed down her back, tracing the curve of her spine. "I have had a plan for 5 years. I was just waiting for you to remember enough to run." Hermione pulled back slightly to look at him. "You were waiting for me? I couldn't drag you across the border if you thought I was kidnapping you." He said wryly, the smallest trace of his old smirk returning. You were difficult enough to manage when you thought you were just a fugitive archivist. Hermione huffed a soft laugh. The sound felt foreign in the dark office, but it felt right. I'm still difficult, she warned him, her eyes bright. Malfoy leaned down, his silver eyes completely soft. He brushed his lips against hers, a fleeting, tender touch that sent a sharp thrill down her spine. I know, he whispered. I wouldn't have it any other way. Part 5. The stumble, the quiet didn't last long. They had less than 2 hours. 2 hours of sitting together on the leather sofa in the dark, Hermione's head resting over Draco's heart, tracing the line of his jaw while the rain beat against the glass. For 2 hours, the war didn't exist. The regime didn't exist. It was just the two of them, stealing time they didn't have. Then, the heavy oak door flew open. Theo didn't bother shutting it behind him. He looked entirely disheveled, the perpetual smirk completely wiped from his face. Draco was on his feet in an instant, pushing Hermione behind him. His wand was out and humming with lethal magic before Theo had taken 3 steps into the room. They know, Theo said, completely breathless. Draco's wand hand didn't waver. Who knows what? Travers, Theo panted, running a hand through his wet hair. He pulled the restricted registry logs. He matched her fake name to the archive breach. They aren't looking for a rat anymore. They are looking for her. Travers just ordered a full Inquisition strike squad. They're coming to sweep your office. Hermione's blood ran cold. How long? Draco demanded sharply. 5 minutes. Theo said. Maybe less. I stole them on the 3rd floor, but Travers is out for blood. If they find her in here, Draco, you're dead. They'll execute you in the atrium. Draco lowered his wand. The exhaustion was gone. The cold, ruthless mask snapped over his features so fast it made Hermione dizzy. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was the High Enforcer, and he was preparing for war. Get out of here, Theo, Draco ordered. Draco! Go! Draco snarled, the raw ferocity in his voice making both of them jump. If Travers catches you tipping me off, he'll hang you next to me. Get out. Theo looked at Draco. He looked at Hermione. He gave a sharp, frantic nod and vanished back out the door, breaking into a dead run down the corridor. Draco turned to Hermione. He didn't look at her like a lover. He looked at her like a problem he had exactly 3 minutes to solve. He crossed the room and grabbed the heavy black cloak he had given her earlier. He shoved it into her hands. Put this on, he ordered, his voice clipped and entirely void of emotion. Hermione shrugged the heavy fabric over her shoulders. Her hands were shaking violently. Draco, what are we doing? He ignored her. He walked to his desk and slammed his palm against a hidden panel on the side. A small drawer popped open. He pulled out a smooth, unmarked portkey and a heavy pouch of galleons. He shoved both into the pockets of her cloak. That portkey goes to a safe house in France, he said quickly, not looking at her. It is unplottable. The money will last you 2 years if you are careful. Do not use magic. Do not contact anyone. Hermione gaped at him. France? What about you? Draco stopped. He finally looked at her. His silver eyes were bright, fierce, and utterly unyielding. I'm staying here, he said. No. Hermione stepped forward. No, you can't. If Travers finds me missing, he'll know you helped me. He'll kill you. Travers is a bureaucrat, Draco sneered dismissively. I am the High Enforcer. I will handle him. You can't handle a full strike squad. Hermione yelled, her voice echoing in the large office. They'll torture you. They'll tear your mind apart. Draco stepped into her space. He grabbed her upper arms. His grip was tight, desperate, exactly like it had been in the basement. They will not break me, he said fiercely. I have kept this secret for 10 years. I will take it to my grave. But you are leaving. I am not leaving you behind. You do not have a choice. Draco raised his wand. He pointed the tip directly between her eyes. Hermione gasped, stumbling back, but his grip on her arms was like iron. He didn't let her move. Draco, she whispered, her voice cracking. What are you doing? What I should have done in the first place, he said. His voice was shaking now. The mask was cracking again. I'm going to wipe your memory, Hermione. Entirely. No. She fought him, twisting her arms, but he was much stronger. He backed her up against the heavy wooden desk, pinning her exactly where they had been kissing less than an hour ago. I'm going to wipe every trace of me from your mind. Draco said, tears welling in his bright silver eyes. I'm going to erase this office. I'm going to erase the archives. I'm going to erase 10 years ago. Please, she sobbed, pushing frantically against his chest. Draco, please don't do this. If I don't, you will try to come back for me, he said, his voice dropping into a desperate, raw whisper. And if you come back, they will kill you. I cannot let them kill you. I won't run. She screamed at him. I won't run without you. You will, he promised softly. Because you won't know who you are running from. He adjusted his grip, holding her steady. The tip of his wand glowed with a faint, terrible silver light. The Obliviate Charm. He was gathering the magic. Hermione stopped fighting. She stopped pushing against his chest. She stopped twisting her arms. She looked up at him. Tears were streaming down her face, but she looked entirely, fiercely resolute. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her own skirt. She pulled out the spare wand she had stolen from the lower archives weeks ago. She raised it. She pressed the tip directly over his heart. Draco stopped. The silver light at the end of his wand flickered, but he didn't lower it. He looked down at the wand pressed against his chest, and then back up at her tear-stained face. Put it down, Granger. He warned. No. Hermione pushed the wand harder against his sternum. Her hand was shaking violently, but her voice was absolutely steady. You are not doing this to me again. I'm saving your life. You're ruining it. She cried. You're taking my choices away. You took 10 years of my life because you decided you knew better. You are not taking the rest of it. If I don't... Draco yelled, his composure finally shattering completely. They are going to kill you, Hermione. Travers is walking down the hall right now. Do you want to die? I want to stay with you. The absolute silence that followed her shout was deafening. Draco looked at her. The silver light at the end of his wand completely died. You're a fool. He whispered. I don't care, Hermione said, crying harder. If you wipe my memory, Draco Malfoy, I swear to you, I will just fall in love with you all over again. I will find my way back, and I will do it all again. Do not take this from me. Draco's hand began to shake. The great, terrifying High Enforcer of the regime looked completely broken. He looked at the wand in his hand, and then at the wand pressed against his heart, letting out a ragged, devastated breath. He dropped his wand, letting it hit the floor with a loud clatter. Hermione sobbed in relief. She dropped her own wand and threw her arms around his neck. Draco caught her immediately. He wrapped his arms around her waist and buried his face in her shoulder. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe. He was shaking. The man who had faced the Dark Lord without blinking was trembling in her arms. You are going to be the death of me, Granger, he whispered into her hair. We are getting out of here, Hermione said fiercely. Together. Draco pulled back slightly. He looked at the heavy oak door. The sound of heavy, booted footsteps echoed down the stone corridor outside. Travers. We don't have time, Draco said. The anti-apparition wards are locked. The only way out is the port key, and it only has enough magic to carry one person. Then we make another way. Hermione insisted. There is no other way. Travers has 30 auras with him. You're the High Enforcer. Hermione reminded him, grabbing his face in her hands. You know this building better than anyone. You know the blind spots. Draco looked at her. He looked at the fierce, defiant fire in her eyes. The fire that had survived a war and a memory wipe. The fire he had spent 10 years protecting. He took a deep breath. The exhaustion vanished. The hesitation vanished. When he looked back at the door, the Enforcer mask didn't return. Something much more dangerous took its place. He looked like a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Grab your wand. Draco ordered sharply. Hermione bent down and snatched her wand off the floor. Draco picked his up. He stepped in front of her, shielding her entirely with his body. He pointed his wand at the heavy oak door just as the handle began to turn. Stay close, he commanded over his shoulder. Do not let go of my hand. He reached back. Hermione grabbed his left hand, intertwining her fingers with his. His grip was absolute. What are we doing? She asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Draco didn't look back. He kept his eyes locked on the door as it slammed open. Travers stood in the doorway, a dozen heavily armed auras flanking him. We. Draco said smoothly, his voice dropping into a lethal, aristocratic drawl, are going to burn this place to the ground. The tension in the room was absolute. Travers stood in the doorway, his wand already drawn. The auras behind him fanned out into the corridor, effectively blocking any chance of escape. They looked exactly like the ruthless strike squad they were trained to be, but they hesitated when they saw the High Enforcer standing protectively in front of the fugitive. Draco's grip on Hermione's hand tightened. It was the only warning she got. Malfoy, Travers barked, his eyes darting between the two of them. Step aside. The Dark Lord has ordered her immediate execution. The Dark Lord is not here, Draco said smoothly. I am. He didn't wait for Travers to process the treason. Draco slashed his wand in a violent arc. A wave of concussive force exploded outward, shattering the massive glass window behind them and throwing the first 3 oars backward into the stone wall with a sickening crunch. The glass rained down on the cobblestones far below, letting the freezing rain pour into the office. "Stay behind me!" Draco roared over the sudden chaos. Spells lit up the dark office in blinding flashes of green and red. Hermione raised her stolen wand, deflecting a lethal curse meant for Draco's back, her heart pounding in her ears. Part 6. Salt the earth. The office went up like dry tinder. Draco didn't just cast a standard incendiary curse. He cast Fiend Fire. The cursed flames exploded from the tip of his wand the second Travers stepped into the room. A massive, roaring chimera made of pure, white-hot fire lunged at the doorway. The Aurors didn't even have time to scream. Travers dove backward into the corridor as the flames consumed the heavy oak door, instantly turning the ancient wood to ash. The fire roared, hungry and completely devastating, catching on the velvet curtains and the massive brass filing cabinets. Draco didn't let go of Hermione's hand. He pulled her behind the heavy mahogany desk as the heat in the room skyrocketed. The fire was spiraling wildly, eating through the floorboards and melting the silver inkwells in seconds. "The port key!" Draco shouted over the deafening roar of the flames. "Take it out!" Hermione scrambled in the heavy pocket of the black cloak. Her fingers closed around the smooth, unmarked stone. She pulled it out. "I have it!" She yelled back. "Hold on to it!" Draco commanded. He raised his wand again. He wasn't trying to put the fire out. He was feeding it. He pointed his wand at the massive restricted archive cabinet in the corner. The chimera of fire lunged at it, tearing through the metal like wet paper. 10 years of the regime's most guarded secrets, 10 years of Inquisition logs and death records, burned into nothingness in a single heartbeat. Hermione watched the flames reflected in Draco's silver eyes. He looked entirely terrifying. And he looked completely beautiful. He was salting the earth. He was leaving them nothing. The ceiling began to groan. The structural wards of the ministry were failing under the sheer, unbridled power of the fiend fire. Chunks of burning stone began to crash down around them. Draco dropped his wand. He turned to her, grabbing her shoulders. He pressed her back against the desk, shielding her entirely from the falling debris with his own body. "The port key," he said, his voice dropping into a desperate, frantic shout over the noise. "It can only take one of us past the anti-apparition wards. You have to go." "No!" Hermione screamed, grabbing fistfuls of his crisp white shirt. "You promised. We do this together. If I try to hold on, the magic will fail." He yelled back, his face inches from hers. "We will both materialize inside a solid wall. You have to go first. I am not leaving you here to burn." A massive chunk of the ceiling collapsed directly behind them. The heat was unbearable. Draco's shirt was singed at the edges. "I can apparition jump out the window," Draco shouted, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones frantically. "The wards end 20 feet down. If I jump, I can break through before I hit the ground. But you cannot survive the fall. You have to take the port key." Hermione looked at him. She looked at the terrifying drop out the shattered window. She looked at the roaring chimera of fire closing in on them. "Do you swear?" She demanded, tears streaming down her face from the smoke. "Do you swear you'll jump?" "I swear on my life, Hermione." He screamed. I swear it. Now go. He grabbed her hand. He forced her fingers tightly around the smooth stone. Then, he leaned down and kissed her. It was hard, fast, and completely desperate. A promise sealed in fire. I will find you, he breathed against her lips. He tapped the stone with his wand. Portus. The familiar, sickening hook jerked behind Hermione's navel. The roaring flames, the crashing stone, and Draco's terrified, beautiful face were ripped away in a dizzying blur of color and sound. She slammed into solid ground entirely too hard. Hermione rolled across wet grass, gasping for air. The port key skittered away into the darkness. She scrambled to her knees, her chest heaving, coughing up the thick taste of smoke. It was raining. She was in a small, overgrown garden. A quaint stone cottage sat completely dark in front of her. The safe house in France. It was utterly silent. Hermione stumbled to her feet. She looked wildly around the empty garden. Draco? She called out. Her voice cracked. Nothing. Only the sound of the rain hitting the leaves. Draco! She screamed louder, panic clawing at her throat. What if he didn't make it to the window? What if the floor collapsed? What if the wards caught him midair? She fell to her knees in the wet grass. The heavy black cloak was soaked through. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. A sharp, familiar crack of apparition echoed through the garden. Hermione's head snapped up. A tall figure stood at the edge of the wards. He was completely soaked. His pristine white shirt was covered in soot and blood. He was swaying slightly on his feet. Draco, she breathed. He looked up. He saw her kneeling in the grass. He collapsed. Hermione ran. She sprinted across the slippery grass, throwing herself down beside him. Draco! Draco, look at me! She rolled him onto his back. He was bleeding heavily from a massive cut on his forehead, and his left arm was bent at a completely unnatural angle. He had clipped the pavement before he apparate. He groaned, his silver eyes fluttering open. Granger! He rasped. He reached up with his good right hand, his soot-stained fingers catching in her wild curls. You're crying. You idiot. She sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. You absolute, wonderful idiot. He let out a short, breathy laugh that turned into a wince. The things I do for you. Shut up, she whispered. She grabbed her wand. She pointed it at his broken arm. Ferular. Thick white bandages wrapped tightly around his arm, splintering it into place. Draco hissed in pain, his eyes squeezing shut, but he didn't pull away. She moved her wand to his forehead, sealing the cut with a quick, whispered healing charm. Can you stand? She asked, wiping the blood off his face with the sleeve of her cloak. I can, he murmured, his eyes opening again. They were incredibly soft. If you help me. Hermione pulled his right arm over her shoulders. She wrapped her own arm tightly around his waist. Together, they stumbled across the wet grass toward the dark cottage. The heavy wooden door unlocked with a simple wave of her wand. The inside of the cottage was dusty, but it was warm. It smelled like dried lavender and old books. The wards on the house hummed a quiet, completely safe note. They had made it. They were out. Hermione guided him to the small sofa in the sitting room. Draco sank into the cushions with a heavy sigh. He let his head fall back, his eyes slipping shut. "We need to get those wet clothes off," Hermione said, her voice shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. "You first," Draco murmured blindly, a faint ghost of his old smirk playing on his lips. Hermione let out a watery laugh. "You are completely impossible." She didn't argue. She shrugged off the heavy, soaked cloak. She kicked off her boots. Then, she walked over to him. She gently unbuttoned his ruined white shirt, peeling the cold, wet fabric away from his skin. She tried not to look at the faded scars that littered his chest, or the ugly, dark ink of the mark on his forearm. Draco didn't move. He just let her take care of him. When she was finished, she found a thick woolen blanket in a nearby chest. She threw it over him. "Sleep," she ordered softly. Draco reached out. He caught her hand. "Stay with me," he whispered. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Hermione didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the small sofa next to him. Draco pulled her flush against his chest. He wrapped his good arm securely around her waist, burying his face in her wild, damp curls. He breathed in deeply, his whole body finally relaxing into the cushions. Hermione rested her head over his heart. It was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. She closed her eyes. When Hermione woke up, the cottage was flooded with bright, golden sunlight. The rain was completely gone. She blinked, adjusting to the light. The fire in the small hearth had been lit, casting a warm glow across the dusty room. She wasn't lying on his chest anymore. Draco was asleep, his head resting heavily in her lap. Hermione looked down at him. In the bright morning light, the shadows were completely gone from his face. The cold enforcer of the regime was dead. The boy who had made terrible choices was gone. He was just a man. A man who had burned his entire world to the ground just to keep her safe. He shifted in his sleep. His right hand instinctively reached up, his fingers wrapping loosely around her wrist, anchoring himself to her even in his dreams. Hermione smiled softly. She gently ran her fingers through his fine blonde hair, smoothing the messy strands away from his forehead. They were fugitives. The regime would hunt them. The war was still raging across the channel. But they were alive. They were together. Draco let out a quiet sigh, his face pressing deeper into her lap, perfectly content. Hermione leaned down. She pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his temple. The world was broken, but they had all the time in the world to put it back together. The end.